Hi, this is Arvind Bharti, and we are here at Open Source Summit in San Diego. And today we have with us Dirk Hohndel. You are VP and Chief Open Source Officer at the Open Source Program Office at VMware. So I will talk about this office also. But before that, it's not that I have noticed, everybody knows that open source has become the de facto software development model, which also means that there are a lot of companies who are not traditional open source companies, but they are kind of embracing or going on to this journey. So can you talk a bit about how they kind of move from being a proprietary company to not fully open source company, but they become a good citizen of open source?
So I think open source has become a methodology that's very common in the industry. I don't think it's the de facto standard model, because most software that is developed in the US, in the world, is developed as in-house applications for large companies. So if you talk to large banks, for example, they have thousands and thousands of software developers. If you talk to most companies, most larger companies, they will tell you that they now are software-defined businesses. So the way they write software defines how they innovate. And in that space, open source components, open source tool chains, open source infrastructure, open source APIs have become the dominating way people look at the development process, yet still a lot of proprietary software is part of their infrastructure, of their tool chain, of the way they deliver their applications. And of course, everything that they write in-house stays proprietary to them. It's rare, but it happens that companies open source internal tools. For example, VMware a couple of years ago open sourced Clarity, an open source design system for JavaScript-based UIs. So you do this in order to get a collaboration with other companies working in a similar space, get input and suggestions and contributions from the outside. Yet the vast majority of the software is never open source. It just relies on open source components to become reality.
Yeah, I think the reason I said that because I live under an open source bubble. So everybody I talk to are doing some kind of open source. So I assume a world where it is the de facto. But you are absolutely right. But if you just pick the case of VMware, I mean, it's not a traditional open source company, but you have an office now. So how is the company itself going through that transition of becoming a good citizen of open source?
Pretty much all software today is built on open source. So you have open source components that are critical to being able to rapidly develop your software.
Right.
And the more you rely on open source, the more important it becomes that you are part of those communities, that you are able to understand how the software is developed, the release cycle, the security processes, the overall philosophy behind those different projects. And of course, as you find issues, you contribute them back, you fix the software, you make it better, you become a good citizen of these communities. And as this process goes on in a company, at some point you have to ask yourself, what's the strategic value of what I'm doing here? Why am I doing this? And typically that is the catalyst question that gets a company to create an open source program office. Because you really want to be able to clearly articulate which software is important, which open source components are important, how are you helping to sustain them, to make them better, to make them continue to be supported and be around, and how can you possibly influence the direction to better serve your needs. And as you think through these questions, and as you think through your engagement with those projects, and creation of an open source program office is typically a very natural answer to that. But one of the things that I always find interesting is that a lot of people seem to assume that just because you use an open source component, that is something that you need to engage in. Whereas very often you have to ask yourself the question, what's strategic for me? Where does my company create the differentiation? Where do we create the value? Which means, where do we want to invest? Where do we want to build expertise? So we go to so many events where everyone is super excited about Kubernetes. Obviously, VMware is a big contributor and a very strong promoter of Kubernetes. But to us, that is a strategic part of what we do. We provide the software that allows you to orchestrate your workloads, and Kubernetes is one of the ways to do that. But if you look at the case of an end user, the question is is an investment in Kubernetes, in the expertise of Kubernetes development, really the right investment for them? Or isn't the value that they want to create higher up in the stack closer to the custom applications they write for their business processes? And that's this trade-off. Open source is not equal Kubernetes. 10 years ago, everyone you talked to about open source thought you were talking about Linux. 5 years ago, everyone was talking about OpenStack. Today, everyone's talking about Kubernetes. Yet open source is so much more. It's such a tremendously broad term with millions of projects and so many different ways to engage. And this is where a dedicated office that focuses on what do we do, why do we do it, how do we do it, that is a clear value for you as a company.
And do you see a trend where companies are doing it, or there are still a lot of companies who are struggling with that? What kind of awareness is there?
I think we see a lot more companies that have their own formal or sometimes informal open source program offices, and we see a lot more engagement around that. So if you look at the to-do group inside the Linux Foundation, which is a group where open source program officers across different companies meet and exchange their experiences and help each other with best practices and policies and whatnot. There is massive interest in that, and every other week another company joins. So we see a lot of pickup on that, and I think most companies that look at the idea of having an open source program office see tremendous value in that, because it helps you focus your investment. It helps you rationalize your decisions and understand where you should engage and where you should look for other solutions. Because one of the most important things to learn for anybody engaging in open source is a wonderful methodology, but it's not always the only or necessarily the right answer. So if you are a small company that focuses on the delivery of a specific service, then building up expertise at every level of your stack is going to be prohibitively expensive. You need to focus on the layer in the stack where you can create value, where you can differentiate. And then you can take advantage of products and services that are out there that leverage open source, but that give you a turnkey solution that you can simply use without having to invest into expertise in these areas.
I actually love talking to you because you kind of refine the message that open source methodology versus open source has become the de facto software development model. So and earlier also at one point you said no, you don't consume open source. So I really love the way you refine the messaging and polish it. While I do see a trend that companies are becoming. At the same time, I don't want to name any company, but due to cloud vendors, some companies are worried that their code gets used or abused or whatever it is, and they are trying to come up with some clauses that. So there are two ways of looking at it. That first of all, open source, there's nothing new about that. A lot of companies have been doing it, and so first of all, are you worried about it? Number one. Number two is that do you see that open source should tackle this in the way of license, or it will resolve itself?
So I think what you're hinting at is some of the new licenses that we have seen, mostly around database companies actually, yes. But there have been a few others as well. And there has always been a lively discussion in the communities, what is open source, what is not open source, what licenses are acceptable, what licenses are considered abusive or just not in the spirit of open source, and that continues. We've had this 15 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and we have it today. That sequence of licenses that try to very specifically target a way of delivering open source software that those companies found abusive, which is a large cloud vendor basically offering their software as a service without contributing anything back. I understand the plight of these projects. I understand that it's very frustrating. On the flip side, so far the solutions that have been tried, so the license extensions or the new licenses that have been written, I'm not necessarily happy about, because they fundamentally violate one of the key ideas that I find in open source software, which is that you don't restrict how your software is used. That fundamental freedom that is defined in the OSI definition is violated by all these licenses that say, oh, you can use this software unless you do the following thing. And we have a similar problem, maybe 10 years ago, it was the rage to have these licenses that says, oh, you can't use this software for evil, or you can't use this software in the nuclear power plant, or you can't use this software for, we had this, when was it, maybe half a year ago, where one project tried to prevent the US government from using their software in protest to the handling of immigrants. Those are all good causes, those are laudable thoughts, but the way they're implemented is not necessarily a good solution. And so I think there is always room for improvement. There are always ways in which we can make our licenses better, more fair, and how we can ensure that the software developers actually have a way to make a living. Draconian license changes maybe aren't the way. One of the things that we are trying to do at VMware is we're trying to create a marketplace where software vendors, so the companies behind these databases and caching structures and infrastructure components can offer their software as a service through our infrastructure and get paid by the end user. So we are trying to create a venue through which they can actually make a living developing their open source software and offering it to their customers. Other companies have done similar things. I know Google announced this earlier this year that they have a strategic effort to make those database products available in conjunction with the companies behind those database projects. I think there is a lot of room to explore creative ideas that actually help both the end user and the developers who are creating these open source projects. So I think this is a space where we'll see a lot more innovation over the next few years.
Yeah, because the emergence of cloud and all those things will change, evolve. So there will be a lot of discussion going on, and it will happen. And all those, the clauses that are being added, it's just like quick knee-jerk kind of band-aid. But they're not. I
wouldn't say knee-jerk. I mean, I think those projects thought long and hard about it. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that happens is if you are in an environment where you have a legal team that says the following kinds of licenses aren't acceptable, and suddenly a project that you rely on switches the license on you, and they say all new security updates are under the new license. Your legal department tells you you can't use that license. Now you're suddenly stuck. You can't use the old version because there are potential fatal flaws in it. You can't use the new version, so you are forced to migrate to a different project in mid-production, which is insanely disruptive. And so those unintended consequences are what worry me. It's not that it's a knee-jerk reaction, it's that some of the unintended consequences have potentially very negative outcomes for the users of the software.
No, what I meant was that there has not been a long-term discussion about how to handle this problem. The solution that they came up with, just add a clause which will prohibit some cloud vendor from shipping that in there. That's what I meant. As a community, it's not like, okay, how do we handle this problem? Like, okay, this is like Richard Stallman came up with GNU GPL v3, So he reacted in his own way, which was not accepted by a lot of projects.
But the GPL v3 was an 18 months process with a lot of input from a lot of people, with a lot of deliberation. Some of the licenses that we have seen were literally the first time the community heard about them was the day they were added.
That's what I meant. When I said knee-jerk reaction, that's what I meant by that there was not a long discussion to how to address. They just add this clause and that will solve the problem. That's what I meant by knee-jerk reaction.
Yes.
And that's kind of
October
backfired.
16, that's our license.
Yeah, so that's what I meant, and it backfired in some cases not. But the community was, I think, over a period of time, they will resolve this issue. That's what open source is all about. Another point you may or may not want to touch upon. In China, they have, I think Huawei is founding an open source foundation there itself. You did touch upon that, that some people were like, that, okay, some government agencies using this open source. So my belief as somebody who has been advocating open source is that it doesn't matter who uses the code, you know. It's open source. Terrorists want to use it. I should not be restricting it by the license, you know. How it's used, it's not my problem, you know. My problem is my goal is to create a very collaborative software anybody can use. First of all, do you agree with that? Number two is that should community really concern itself from these who gets to use it or not? Because then you are not that open.
So I think a statement that you don't care who uses the software is slightly misleading. I do care who uses the software.
Okay.
I don't want criminals to use the software. I just believe that the license is not the way to prevent that.
Yeah.
Because regardless how hard you try to find a way to phrase precisely what you think, translation into different languages, into different legal codes, into different cultural contexts will always make this an imprecise definition. And if you look at what is considered human rights or civil rights across different cultures in this world, it's very, very different. It's very hard to draw clear lines in the sand and say, this is okay, this is not okay, and assume that this is globally applicable. So I don't think a license is the way to do that. I think it is entirely reasonable for communities to have strong feelings about how their software is used. And it's also very reasonable that communities want to make sure that the core developers have an opportunity to get paid for their work. Open source is not about charity. It's not about giving things away for free in the no dollar sense. But the answer to these questions is typically an answer around business models, around value proposition that you provide, and not an answer that is simply solved by creating a harsher license or a license that draws arbitrary lines of what is okay and what isn't okay.
Awesome. Dirk, once again, thanks for talking about the new topic, and we'll be exploring the next topic for the next interview.
I very much look forward to that. Thank you, Swapna.